Welcome to the Multimedia and Education presentation. My name is Tiffany Draper. I am currently a high school teacher in Virginia, teaching all levels of high school English. So throughout the presentation, you will hear me reference multimedia and education through the lens of high school teaching. So multimedia is complex. So with that, to understand it a little bit better, I'm going to break it down into a few different sections. First off is going to be understanding what multimedia is from a few different perspectives. Then the science behind how it is effective in the classroom, the theories and principles that establish multimedia, and the results or effectiveness of multimedia in education. So multimedia then, from an English teacher perspective, needs to begin with understanding the definition of multimedia. So we're going to break it down. Multi means many or more than one. Media is the plural form of medium, so it's a means of doing something. And then the mediums for communication are going to be print, oral or verbal, and visual, including static and animated. So multimedia then is combining multiple forms of communication, including newspaper, magazine, television, radio, social media, web media, video games, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because we have so many different options with our technology today, and we're likely only increasing those options. So then multimedia for education, our definition here includes a cognitive theory of learning, which refers to learning from different sources of information, such as words and pictures, in which words are presented as printed on-screen text, or audio narrations and pictures are presented as graphics, diagrams, or animations. So multimedia education for the role of the teacher and the student is probably our first step in being able to understand multimedia and education a little bit better. So multimedia effectiveness is not as simple as whether pictures or animations result in better learning outcomes, which we'll learn about more, but rather under what circumstances. So the initial circumstances need to be trained teachers and trained students. But in order to have trained students in multimedia use, we need to have our teachers trained to be able to teach the students. So teacher training needs to begin in their university setting where they're getting their initial credentials. Teachers need to be taught multimedia use in their teacher education. And then when they reach their teacher destination, whatever school they happen to be teaching at, every school is different. Every school has their own multimedia tools. So a teacher needs, again, additional training once they get to that point. And once trained, access needs to be considered when planning a lesson. So in my school, every student has their own laptop. They've all been given one at the start of the school year. But not every student has Wi-Fi access at home. And if they do, it may not look the same. So for one student, they may have high-speed wireless internet connectivity, and another student may have very spotty internet connection, or may need to go to their nearest coffee shop to receive free Wi-Fi access to be able to do their homework. So it looks different for every student. And because of that, the majority of what we do for our multimedia projects is in the classroom. So when a teacher is doing their lesson planning, they need to make sure that they are focusing on the content of the lesson and not the multimedia use. The multimedia should be a tool to help us with our lesson planning and not the focus. So tech incorporation needs to be deliberate. And in that process, student participation will look expanded. The engagement increases through multimedia use, and understanding increases through multimedia use, including assessment, which we'll continue with our discussion further on in the presentation, because assessment needs to be like any design plan at the beginning, middle, and end for comprehension, for retention, and for engagement. So part of our student teacher role to improve the implementation of multimedia, the role of faculty will need to be redefined to allow more creativity in teaching, one-on-one tutoring, coaching, and mentoring, and to permit faculty to offload rote learning aspects of education. The high school and universities themselves will need to be restructured to allow faculty to be rewarded for development and implementation of multimedia. But reward can look different for every faculty, for every school. So that could be compensation financially, it could be compensation through time, providing additional lab space, whatever that might be. and possibly to permit the partial elimination of books or lectures depending on the situation. So for implementing more multimedia, what is going to be removed or compensated for in that regard? So multimedia technology brings about the improvement in teaching and learning. However, there are a number of limitations in this technology for educational purposes. Some of these limitations include unfriendly programming or user interface, limited resources, lack of required knowledge and skill, limited time, and high cost of maintenance, among others. So with that training, with that access, we also need to look at funding. We don't always have the resources necessary. We don't always have the skills and trainings available, the time and the maintenance that is involved with several of these options. So in continuation, despite the impact of multimedia tools on the improvement of teaching and learning activities, it could be counterproductive if the computer-based tools are not properly designed or the instructional materials are not well composed. The review showed that multimedia adoption in education requires adequate understanding of technology and multimedia types or the components required to properly represent concepts or ideas. This implies that a teacher must understand the learners and know that technology or tool needs to be adopted at a given time for a set of targets. So according to reviews, again, the target groups determine the type of multimedia components employed while preparing instructional materials and the ways they are to be delivered. We need proper planning. And in order to plan properly, it is important to understand our audience, just like every good teacher understands. So our current audience are Generation Z students, especially in high school and in college. And we've got another set of younger students coming up in elementary school, but our Generation Z students can be referred to iGen, our iGeneration. They're usually understood to be between 1995 and 2012, give or take a couple of years. They've been dubbed as very tech savvy. So you can see the older generations often asking the Generation Z and I generation to help them with their technological devices. They've been considered digital natives. But because of these definitions, we've kind of given them more credit than they really deserve when it comes to the younger group or when they've been through elementary through high school. We assume because they know their devices that they know everything else that comes with that, which is not the case. So because of this, they're now being called digitally naive. These students may be able to navigate the device, but they may not necessarily understand how to navigate the information that they are given. So what happens is they don't necessarily understand the difference between fake news and real news. They may not understand how to find good sources as they are doing research. They may not even understand how to research properly. So they're just being thrown tons and tons of social media, so much overwhelming information that they need guides to help them through all of the multimedia that's out there. So according to Rewired, Understanding the iGeneration, we've got number 6. They have different learning styles. So we obviously know every student learns differently, but as a whole, the Generation Z group is auditorial and visual, but very tactile, kinesthetic. They're very hands-on. So multimedia lends perfectly to this style of learning for Generation Z. We like this experiential learning. We like group projects. We like hands-on, project-based, problem-based learning. So all of our maker spaces that are coming up, all of our technology that we're using, the multimedia that we're using to problem solve and learn is beneficial to this generation. So they get that, and we're helping them to process all of their information through these things that works best for them. So the style makes the learning process different and suggests different ways of teaching and learning. So our teachers aren't Generation Z. Many of them right now are millennials or Gen Xers who did not grow up with all the technologies. So again, making sure that our teachers are trained well enough to understand the multimedia needed to help these kinesthetic Generation Z learners. So this generation may know the internet, but they need the help of teachers, coaches, guides, whatever we want to call them, to help explain the difference between fake news and real news. These students need help with critical thinking skills, analysis skills, and research skills. So yes, schools must be more responsive to the possibilities afforded by new technologies, that the very structures of schools and classrooms must transform to truly leverage these capabilities. However, we must be critical of the tendency to assume that technology will fantastically solve the intricate problem of schooling. The I generation is different from previous generations in the sense that society has changed with the increase of technology and communication. However, students will always need guides in education that will help students to navigate the vast information that is now at our fingertips. So if a student says, why do I need to learn this when I can Google it? The response needs to be, go right ahead, Google it, tell me what you get. And if you're confused by it, as your teacher, I'm happy to help you figure it out from there. So understanding our students then comes with some safety features. Most of us have been through all of our safety classes for required as part of our job. So we need to make sure we're not clicking on those random emails that have those random virus links. But we also haven't really thought beyond that when it comes to multimedia use in the classroom, and the responsibility that we have as teachers to make sure that we're being safe and responsible and cautious with the multimedia tools that we're implementing. So oftentimes, especially reading teachers, us English teachers, we love our reading apps, especially in elementary age. So as a parent, I've used Starfall, the app for my children when they were little, to help them learn reading comprehension. And it's a fantastic app. I couldn't tell you if it was school approved or not. I believe it was, but I didn't look. So we often will see these 4 out of 5 stars, 5 out of 5 stars, whatever it is, reviews that are for these literacy apps, and think, oh, these must be great apps. But what process, what assessment, what evaluation have they gone through to receive these stars? Are these evaluations, reviews based off of fun? Are they based off of student engagement? Or are they based off of literacy? And are they based off of safety for these students? So as a teacher, our responsibility is to make sure that we are teaching digital citizenship and following digital citizenship. So what that is the responsible use of technology by anyone who uses computers, the internet, and digital devices to engage with society on any level. So teacher level or student level. So students and teachers need to be taught safety and social responsibility for technology use, internet activity, and social media communication. Teachers have been thrown into educational technology with little to known education in how to utilize classroom technology effectively or appropriately, so we would all benefit from better teacher training and digital citizenship. In our attempt to utilize the classroom technology, we do quick learning app screenings, scanning the reviews, better implementing a free app in our classrooms. Some teachers share login credentials to allow students access to these multiple multimedia apps. The legality, the liability, and safety concerns are bypassed generally without any awareness on the teacher's part. So it's not for lack of care so much as it is lack of awareness and understanding. So as we are selecting these things, we need to make sure we are going through evaluation processes. The next step in understanding multimedia in education is understanding how multimedia in education works. What's the science behind it? It involves our memories and how we process information and retain information through short-term memory to working memory to long-term memory, all within this information processing. So working memory is short-term memory that's used to execute specific tasks. The short-term memory stores information for a few seconds, while the working memory processes and structures the information for a short time. Working memory then is the small amount of information that can be held in mind and used in the execution of cognitive tasks, in contrast with long-term memory, which is the vast amount of information saved in one's life. So we are using this short-term memory, and within that, we have working memory in there that's processing to be transitioned to long-term memory if it's something we want to retain and store. So it says information processing then is how individuals perceive, analyze, manipulate, use, and remember information. It's an ongoing and gradual cognitive development. It's how we make memories, how we retain information, and how we retrieve information. So multimedia allows us to perceive information through different channels, through visual channels, through audio channels, combining those things to retain them and understand them differently. So it says, according to Nagmati in 2017, to avoid death by PowerPoint, we strive to help our students find their whys. It is important for instructors to understand the scientific basis of how people learn and how the human brain processes various types of stimuli so that they can design technically and scientifically sound presentations. For example, using the Myers multimedia principles. So knowledge construction then is based on 3 principles from research in the cognitive science. There's dual channels. People have separate channels for processing visual or pictorial material and auditory verbal material. And then we have limited capacity. Okay, back to the short-term memory aspect. People can actively process only a few pieces of information in each channel at one time. And then the active processing. Learning occurs when people engage in appropriate cognitive processing during learning, such as attending to relevant material, organizing the material into coherent structures, and integrating it with what they already know, right? So in order for us to be able to retain information, we have to make those connections. So 7 plus or minus 2 is a phrase that refers to the capacity or limits of working memory. That is, people can generally think about only a few items at one time, around 7 plus or minus 2 items at a time in this working memory. So instructional methods in e-lessons must guide the learner's transformation of words and pictures in the lesson through working memory so that they are incorporated into the existing knowledge in long-term memory. So manipulating this process. So if we can understand how it all works, teachers can then better plan their lessons using multimedia to help students convert their short-term memory into long-term memory. So it says our cognitive systems have limited capacity, right? Since there are too many sources of information competing for this limited capacity, the learner must select those that best match his or her goals, right? Those connections, what they really need. We know this selection process can be guided by instructional methods that direct the learner's attention. Again, understanding how it works, we're able to manipulate it. So if you highlight certain things, if you circle certain things in presentations, if you help things to stand out, as we're pointing at information along the way, making gestures, or however it is that works best as we learn about our audience and the different techniques and in the theories and principles that will help us to be able to get our students to remember things long term. This is therefore instructional methods that overload working memory make learning more difficult. Okay, so the burden imposed on working memory in the form of information that must be held plus information that must be processed is referred to as cognitive load. So methods that reduce cognitive load foster learning by freeing working memory capacity for learning. Okay, so it's that sensory overload that we need to consider as we are understanding how the science behind multimedia works. So instructional methods in e-lessons must guide the learner's transformation of words and pictures in the lesson through working memory so that they are incorporated into the existing knowledge in long-term memory. So these events rely on several different processes, or 4, not several. Selection of important information in the lesson. Okay, so we can't just have everything out there that we want, right? We want to teach them everything, but really they need specifics. And then 2, management of the limited capacity in working memory to allow the processing needed for learning, chunking information that is important. And then 3, integration of auditory and visual sensory information in working memory with the existing knowledge in long-term memory by way of processing in working memory. Okay, so what that really means is just working back and forth between long-term memory and short-term memory using the working memory, right? So we retrieve information from long-term memory to help make connections in short-term memory to bring some of that short-term memory into long-term memory. Okay, so it's, again, making connections, but using both sections to create those comprehension aspects. And then number 4, retrieval of new knowledge and skills from long-term memory into working memory when needed later. So those things that we just transferred back into our long-term memory, being able to retrieve those when needed. So just because you studied really well on for the test and you were able to make those connections from short-term memory to long-term memory, being able to figure out how to retrieve that information from long-term memory when needed is important as well. So working memory integrates the words and pictures in a lesson into a unified structure and further integrates these ideas with existing knowledge in long-term memory. The integration of words and pictures is made easier by lessons that present the verbal and visual information together rather than separated. The theories and principles of multimedia education help ground multimedia education, help us to understand how that science works as a whole. It helps us to be able to compare things, evaluate things when we understand that there are basic solid principles to help us to understand it and utilize it effectively and consistently across education. So first we have cognitive theory of multimedia learning. What that is that it, in short, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning assumes that the human mind is a dual channel with limited capacity, again, with that 7 ± 2 ability to retain information in short-term memory, active processing system, and that presenters must construct multimedia messages to manage all 3 types of cognitive load accordingly. So the dual channel, limited capacity, and active processing system. So that is the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. The cognitive affective theory of learning with media extends the cognitive theory of multimedia learning to better integrate the role of motivation. That is the effective motivation that mediate learning by increasing or decreasing the amount of cognitive resources that a learner invests on a task. And then dual coding theory states that cognition relies on 2 separate but interconnected systems. So dual meaning 2, those 2 systems are a verbal system for language and a nonverbal system that deals with visual images. So those 2 things work together either well or not well, depending on the overload that may happen. So cognitive load theory then has to do with that. So it has 2 assumptions. The first is that the human cognition process has 2 parts, again, working memory and long-term memory. The working memory is limited in terms of its capacity and duration, which we've mentioned, while the long-term memory is unlimited. The second assumption is that schemata are cognitive structures that allow information temporarily stored in working memory to be transferred into long-term memory and thus reduce working memory load, which means that we then need to remember how to retrieve that information from long-term memory. So our principles of multimedia learning then help us out with all of this. So these different ones are spatial continuity, which is deeper learning when corresponding text and pictures, animation are presented near rather than far from each other on the screen, right? So if we're going to have text and pictures, they need to be together, close together, so that they make sense, that we understand that that's there in relation to each other. So if you have a diagram on a screen of a body and you're trying to remember the different body parts in a biology class, the names of the parts need to be right next to what they're labeling in order for it to not just make sense, but work cognitively into our memory. So spatial continuity, using your space appropriately. Temporal contiguity is deeper learning when corresponding text and pictures animation are presented simultaneously rather than successively. So we want them at the same time as well, not just one after the other. Coherence principle then is deeper learning when extraneous narration, sounds, images, and video are excluded rather than included. Okay, so we want very little distraction. Interactivity principle then is deeper learning when learners are allowed to control the presentation rather than when they are not. So being able to click through a presentation on their own so that they can use their time to read through things, to comprehend things before it moves on to the next slide or the next piece of information is more helpful in multimedia use. And then signaling principle is when people learn better when the words include cues about the organization of presentation. So things like a table of context that helps you to go, okay, this is the process of what we're going to be learning, as well as titles and subtitles, anything that not just organizes, but organizes in advance, that signal of this is what's coming, or this is what you're going to learn, so that it preps the student in understanding what's going to happen next. Modality principle then is deeper learning when words are presented as narration rather than as on-screen text. So though I have screen text right now, I am narrating the information about each of these items, which is part of the modality principle. Personalization principle is when people learn better when the words are in conversational style rather than formal style. So if I am talking to you very informally, and I mentioned that I'm a teacher and I'm a parent and I understand how this works in this scenario and in this situation, it's a little bit easier to understand, comprehend, retain than if I were to simply robotically get up here and say the definition of personalization principle is to be informal, right? Because that's going to completely do the opposite of what I'm intending to do. The voice principle then kind of goes along with that idea of personalization. The voice principle is about using a human voice rather than a robotic stereoed voice as well. Individual differences principle is 1, stronger for low knowledge learners, and 2, stronger for high spatial learners, right? So individualizing through multimedia. And then lastly is this redundancy principle. So it says that deeper learning occurs when words are presented as narration rather than as both narration and on-screen text. So as I mentioned how I have both text and narration up here, I don't have everything I'm speaking in text. I just have bulleted items up behind me and next to me to help signal what I'm going to be talking about, rather than having everything I'm saying up on the screen, causing you to have to read it and hear me at the same time, which then becomes distracting for your cognitive processing. So you're able to then comprehend it instead of having a cognitive overload, which a redundancy would cause. But that's not for every single case. So students who are ESL learners, and where English is a second language learners, the redundancy principle, having text on the screen while somebody's talking, so if something has subtitles, right, as they're learning, it actually benefits somebody who is an ESL student more than somebody who is an English speaker and seeing English words and hearing English words at the same time. So the redundancy principle can help by removing redundancy, but it can also hinder depending on the situation. So repetition is important in understanding and learning, but when it comes to multimedia principle, it can be a hinder more than a help in most situations. So lastly, we have the results of multimedia education. How is this effective in our classrooms? How does this help our students? So multimedia education helps our students to retain information, as we are able to help them move information from short-term memory to long-term memory. It helps them to be engaged more. Children and teenagers and college students are more involved in hands-on learning with multimedia education. And then comprehension. Our students, as we can see through the science behind multimedia education, they're able to understand the information better as we utilize those tools in the classroom. So the results of multimedia education then are a gamut of modern educational opportunities for post-graduation success. So students learn several things, including digital literacy, which is the set of technical, audiovisual, behavioral, critical, and social skills that enable users to learn, communicate, socialize, and contribute in the digital space, which is now the career space, right? So much of what we do in the career world is in a digital space. So it's important that we're starting them out in the classroom to understand that digital space. We're also teaching our students the necessary technical skills. So not just the literacy behind it, but the hands-on aspect, which again, this Generation Z may understand the technical devices, but they might only understand it as far as using it for social media, and they may not understand all the other purposes of those technical devices. So including using the computer completely, right? The software and applications to develop digital content as well. And then the audiovisual skills that they need. So skills related to understanding and applying digital media principles that guide the development of digital media artifacts. Important behavioral skills, skills associated with knowing what is acceptable in online communications and netiquette. So this netiquette term has been coined as the etiquette needed in the internet space. So students need to understand safety, security, responsibility, digital citizenship as a whole within these the digital world. So behavioral skills with multimedia use is not just online digital citizenship, but as well as the hands-on collaboration aspect that is face-to-face as we're utilizing our multimedia in the classroom in collaboration with peers and with students and teachers. Critical skills, the ability to search, identify, analyze, and judge online content for credibility. Our students that are flooded with information at their fingertips. This is the information age. So when they say, why do I need to go to school if I can Google everything? Again, we need to remind them that they might be able to Google everything, but they're going to get everything. Being able to help our students navigate the internet effectively is the goal and responsibility of teachers now. We want our students to be brilliant at filtering through the vast amounts of information at their fingertips. And lastly, our students are able to retain social skills, the ability to interact effectively with others online. So through all of the social media processes, through all of the collaborative processes, through multimedia projects, in and out of the classroom, online or not online, because students will be creating multimedia projects in and out of the classroom, whether virtually or not. They are learning those social skills necessary to become successful outside of graduating school so that they can utilize those tools in the career field. So the results again of multimedia education through collaboration and assessment. So multimedia assessment provides guidelines and expectations when implemented at the onset of multimedia projects and provides structure and validity for evaluation when used at the end of multimedia projects. Assessment is a structure for projects that maintains focus for achieving desired results, evaluating student learning, and can be achieved in many ways, including the typical standardized testing, performance assessments, pre-tests and post-tests, formative and summative assessments, rubrics, project-based or problem-based assignments, etc. There are many ways to assess students today, and we are including those additional ones, those project-based assignments that we can use through multimedia collaboration. So using rubrics as an instructional tool has been found to provide clear expectations for an assignment, reduce students' anxiety about an assignment, increase objectivity in grading, and help students perform better than without using a rubric in instruction. So through multimedia projects, we need to make sure that at the onset of the project, the student understands the expectations by not just viewing the rubric, but perhaps being part of the creation of the rubric, and then utilizing that rubric throughout the project process to continue that evaluation and staying on track. And then at the end of a project to make sure that they've evaluated their results and data. So evaluation or rubrics, however you're using your evaluation, whether it's a rubric or another form of evaluation, needs to be at the start for understanding of the project, in the middle throughout the project to maintain understanding, to maintain course and focus, and at the end for evaluation and being able to help us to address needs for future circumstances, right? So if the project is good, then we can make sure that we're continue doing those similar types of projects, right? So if we're evaluating our lesson plans, we can adjust our lesson plans as needed, or change them completely, or continue to do those same lesson plans depending on the results that we get. So our students need to be doing those same things that we're modeling as we evaluate ourselves. So assessment is a key part of multimedia education. So by understanding what multimedia is, by understanding what multimedia and education is, understanding how it works, the science behind all of it, the theories behind all of it, how to best utilize multimedia in our classrooms, we can help our students, our current audience of Generation Z students, and even those coming up, to be better students, to be more successful students, to be able to retain information better, to move information from short-term memory to long-term memory, to retain it, to be engaged better. So multimedia in education is where education is now, right? So with the technology that we currently have, with the age of information that we are currently at, with the internet access, making sure that we are being trained, making sure that we are understanding the inequitable access that maybe our students have at the moment, and being able to be proactive in seeking additional access for these things so that we can continue to utilize them in our classroom is important for the success of our students in their career fields beyond graduation of school, to prepare them for society, to be able to strengthen society in the direction that it's currently going. So thank you for participating, for viewing my presentation on multimedia and education. The resources for this presentation include the following here and here. And for further questions and concerns, you may contact me at tdraper7@liberty.edu. Again, thank you for watching.